Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Fortet 3. Man, it's been a minute since I've talked about Fortet, hasn't it? I've obviously done a full discography review on the guy, done dedicated videos on all his studio albums, and talked about a lot of other stuff he's done in an odds and ends video, and made videos counting down my favorite tracks, and ranking his albums out at the time. Link to the playlist with all of that in the description. We are hopefully no stranger to Kieran Hebden's work at this point. We all know his big classics in the jazzier downtempo vein from the early 2000s, like Pause and Rounds, evolving from there into a typically bright and pleasant IDM style with projects like There Is Love in You, and eventually moving to a much more straightforward micro house and ambient leaning sound pretty much immediately after that point, and sticking to it from there onwards, putting out low-key but refreshing gems such as Pink, Morning Evening, or New Energy that might not have been immediate hitters, especially not the latter of those, but have grown on me to become really big favorites or even proper essentials for the genre in their own right over the years. This whole micro house phase of his career may be somewhat divisive among fans, with many who consider it to be too basic or plain and much less vivid or interesting than the classic work he cut his teeth on in the 2000s. But it has also resulted in him seeing an even greater level of success and attention that he hadn't reached previously, with him even recently having extensively toured with the likes of Skrillex and Fred again. And the guy's just continued to stick to his guns with the same style that's colored most of his work over the past decade plus. Now, going into this album, I'm not going to say I really knew what to expect. His most recent work was a pair of projects from 2020. On one hand, we got 16 Oceans, which was excellent, and in my opinion might very well be the best project he'd put out in that micro house style yet. Maybe. Well, it doesn't have any single one of my biggest favorite individual tracks he'd ever put out, and it stuck to an even more simplistic and ambient-leaning sound than even his other previous projects in the style. It still managed to feel really lush and vibrant and expansive through the wider variety and the way all of it came together as a complete whole. I marked it as my number 3 favorite album of 2020 at the time, and while I'm not sure I'd rank it quite that high now, it'd still definitely be on that list. Although on the flip side, on Christmas of that year, we also got a bonus album from him called Parallel, which I've gone on record to call his weakest main album yet. Kind of throwing together a selection of random abstract ideas that didn't really fit together and had really piss-poor pacing and sequencing, mainly thanks to starting with a 30-minute ambient piece, which felt really out of place next to everything else. I mean, it was still a typically pleasant listen from what I vaguely recall, but I haven't listened to that album a single time since finishing my discography review years ago, and I kind of forgot it even existed at all. It just kind of felt like an afterthought in the grander scheme of his work. After that album, I was hoping that Hebden would, take his time more for his next album, with hopes that it would be able to hit with more impact like 16 Oceans did. And he has in fact done just that, not really having released much in the way of new music aside from loose singles here and there, a few of which, like Loved and 3 Drums, which are included here, that interestingly brought back some of the jazzier breaks that reminded me more of his early pre-There Is Love in You work than anything else he'd done since those days. That definitely intrigued me, so when 3 was announced and released, I jumped into it with high hopes. I did admittedly make the mistake of having my first listen of this thing come immediately after I listened to the Nujabes album, Spiritual State, an instrumental hip-hop classic that shares a very similar vibe in common with many moments on this thing, and thus may have led to this album completely going in one ear and out the other, and falling so far into the background that I might have even forgotten I was listening to Fortet for a while. So yeah, that might not have exactly been the strongest of first impressions, but I continue to sit with this album, hoping to let it grow on me as I would become more familiar with it. So now it's been about a week since it dropped, and yeah, I think I can definitively say this album is good. Another consistent set of work that follows all the usual hallmarks of Fortet sound, a tight 8-track package where none of the tracks feel any more or less important than any other, and are sequenced well to all feel as satisfying as they need to be in context. But I don't know if I'd really rank this thing among one of his absolute best. It's hard to pin down what exactly about it might not work. I don't think I can say it specifically does anything wrong, aside from the fact that I never fully got over that problem of the whole thing kind of falling into the background a bit too easily. Not that Fortet's music is ever like the kind of thing meant to really grab your attention that much in the first place. And all these tracks are good, I just don't know if I'm absolutely in love with any of them, and I feel like all the album's best moments may have just been the ones that were already released as the pre-album singles. For example, the way this project starts with Loved. Really strong start to this thing for sure, bringing in that really strong and crisp hip-hop breakbeat with all the dreamy synth melodies floating on top with all these various bursts of distortion around the edges to give the track some more bite. Feels just as nice and uplifting as you'd want any new Four Tet track to have, but it's exploring these sounds from a new angle that doesn't quite resemble anything else in his catalog. Really solid and striking way for this album to start. Although it wasn't the kind of track that really revealed anything new to me about it beyond the first listen, and also might have left me wishing the rest of the album could match its level of immediacy. Like the following track, Gliding Through Everything, by contrast. That's probably the album's weakest and most inessential moment here. Although even this track is pretty good too, as it hits you with all these glittering bell synths and electric pianos layering over each other in a very pretty and immersive mix. Definitely sounds like any number of other ambient pieces I've heard Four Tet put out, but, you know, it still nails that uplifting atmosphere you want out of them, and I also like the way that there's this whole outro tacked on, forming some other ambient drone out of some stormier guitar feedback, and other plucked guitar textures coming in on top of that. It's nice. But speaking of stormy, next track is called Storm Crystals. In one breath, this is one of the more memorable ideas on the album, less likely to fall into the background without me noticing. Though, on the other hand, I don't know if it got the strongest reaction out of me at any point. Like the way all the plucking synths on this one go up next to the mild foot-tapping beat and some other varied peaceful ambient textures. It kind of makes this feel like a more well-defined companion to an old track of his like LA Trance, with some elements that remind me of his track Scientists. Also, between the slower tempo, the lower energy vibe, and being the second longest track at 6.5 minutes, it is maybe one of the parts of this album more likely to feel like it's just kind of dragging. Still a good track, just, I don't know, never really felt right to be calling it a big standout. Next up though, we got another single in Daydream Repeat, switching us back to more of his standard micro house sound, with him delivering a lot of bright and pretty harp melodies a la his old track My Angel Rocks Back and Forth, going over the usual house beats and being joined by some more distortion effects. Once again, not exactly the kind of thing that really pushes outside of what you'd already expect from him at this point, and reminds me of other tracks of his such as Insect Near Piha Beach, without doing that much to set itself apart as its own memorable thing. But, you know, it is a welcome burst of energy for the album, and I can see it being really easily matched up with other tracks of his in a live setting. Though on the flip side, if you were hoping for something that stands more as its own unique thing in Four Tet's catalog, the following track, Skater, definitely delivers that. I've never heard Hebden put together a track that sounded quite so 80s before, with all these guitar textures that give me kind of like a Pretenders vibe or something. And the way they go up against all these squawking synths and airy female background vocals really add up to this ethereal and almost psychedelic vibe that still fits well enough with the vibe that the rest of the album is going for to not feel out of place. It wasn't a track that stood out to me initially, since the more familiar textures tend to get more focus in the mix than the more unexpected ones like those 80s guitars, but it's still interesting to hear Four Tet try his hand at some of these sounds in a way that works for him without feeling like nostalgia bait or anything like that. I can mark that one as a highlight. Next up we got 31 Bloom, bringing us back to the familiar microhouse formulas with all these various layers of muted, wobbling, filtered synths. Doesn't really deliver among the strongest of tunes, but it's another decently more energetic moment. And my favorite part is actually the whole outro that switches back into some more dramatic droning ambience with a lot of chiming synths layering over each other again. Almost sounds like it's faded into a different song entirely, but the transition and payoff with that is pretty cool. Although speaking of ambience, then we hit penultimate track So Blue, which reprises the same LA Trance style of plucking synths seen on Storm Crystals and kind of presents them in a similar way, going up next to another foot-tapping hip-hop breakbeat later. I'm admittedly less fond of the way the sharper and more metallic texture of those synths come off in comparison to Storm Crystals, but the melodies on this track are stronger, and the way they go up next to these ethereal female vocal snippets that have a little bit more of a soulful edge to them can make up for that. And finally, that leaves the album's closer and lead single, 3 Drums. I remember being really impressed and intrigued by this track when it first dropped, as the way the live drum loop goes up against all those warmer ambient synth washes as well as all these samples of strings and flutes and other woodwinds was the most a track of his had actively reminded me of the sound he used to focus on back in the Rounds days in such a long time, and the way it builds up further and further into all these clouds of noise and distortion gives the whole track a strong post-rock-ish feel to it that I really liked. I feel like this track could theoretically even work matched up with a track of his like Unspoken, and damn, wouldn't that really be something if he brought back that track in his live sets. I seriously doubt he's actually going to do that, but it would be amazing if he did. I might have been a bit disappointed to hear that this track is pretty handily the best track on the album, and the ambient outro does drag on a bit long for its own good, but yeah, this still works perfectly as the big emotional clincher to finish this whole project off. And yeah, that's all my thoughts on 3. Left pretty conflicted on this one, I think. All 8 tracks had something of substance. It's got its standouts mainly in those pre-album singles. It's all around well constructed with no tracks that I didn't at least like. It's an all-around good album, and I can't really take issue with any of it, aside from the fact that he's proven to be able to deliver material in all these same veins that are able to hit me on an even deeper level. Perhaps this will be another case like what happened with New Energy, an album that I was initially really underwhelmed by and had to grow on me over multiple years in order to turn around and cement itself into the great territory I hold it in nowadays. Maybe if I hear the material from this album being presented in more of a live setting, it'll hit better. Fortet doesn't really come to Chicago very often, but I guess I can still hope I'll get to see him someday. I'm less underwhelmed by this than I initially was for New Energy. Like, there's a high floor of quality here, with the worst parts still all being good. This, for instance, clearly outclasses something like Beautiful Rewind, where the tracks could often feel too fragmented and skeletal for their own good. All the tracks here are fleshed out enough to feel like they have some meat on them. But there's a low ceiling of quality as well. Compare this to an album like Pink, which is kind of structured in the same way and has a lot of tracks that sit around a similar level of quality to the material on here. But Pink clearly outclasses this album, at the very least thanks to the 2 individual heights provided by the tracks Pyramid and Pinnacles, which even the best moments here, like Loved or 3 Drums, just cannot compete with. In my old ranking, I think this currently goes above Everything Ecstatic, but below Dialogue. Both of those albums are much more unique and out of the box for him and have much higher high points, but I'm inclined to say this album's greater consistency and better construction as a complete whole is able to put it above the former of those 2. So yeah, I guess that's where I land on 3. Not his most essential work, not the kind of thing I think is going to change the minds of any of his naysayers or be the kind of thing I'd be pointing to as the best, like, jumping on point that explains to possible new fans where his years of hype actually come from. But, you know, certainly a nice, safe bet that's likely to please his core fans, and one that I thought was a pretty good time all around. Enough so where I am willing to just let this off with a light 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. By the way, in case anyone missed it, I am planning to do a bigger Some Stuff I Missed style review roundup, all made out of paid requests. Slots for those are now at a discounted price, just $20 per request there, if anyone is interested. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.